Hi friends, it's Kristen with Hooks, Books, and Wanderlust, and today we are removing the stigma around blocking. What is it, why is it important, and how do you do it? I'm not going to lie, this is going to be one of my longer videos. I want to be as comprehensive as possible to make sure that you have all of the information and tools at your fingertips so that you can use whichever preferred method that you want and block your project successfully. That said, because it is a longer video, I am putting timestamps in the description box below for the various sections of this video so that you can speed up to, go back to, and find exactly what you need in the video when you need it. So let's get started. Often people see instructions in a pattern to block your work or some variation of that. Maybe they don't know how, maybe they want to get right to wearing or using that new project, or maybe they're just ready to be done. I admit when I first started crocheting, I fell into one of those categories at any given time, but I've since come to appreciate this finishing touch as a way to make my work shine. Blocking helps open up lace work. It shows off all those stitches that you've worked so hard on. It also creates crisp, clean lines that give garments, blankets, and smaller motifs a more professional look. No matter which of those reasons apply, blocking takes your work to the next level. So what is blocking exactly? It's the process of adding moisture to your work and gently stretching it and manipulating it into the desired shape and size. There are several instances where you're going to want to block your work. First up, we have lace work, open stitches, mesh, and filet. I use a lot of this stuff typically when I'm doing shawls or table runners and things like that. Anytime you have any kind of open gaps in your fabric that you have crocheted, you want to be able to open those up, and blocking is the way to do that. Another time you're going to want to block is if you have small motifs that are going to be joined together, like the granny squares in this slide. If you're going to join them together, it's helpful to make sure that all the edges are evened out and that they are all the exact same size, and blocking helps you perfect that. Another time is obviously when you need to even out edges, not just for motifs, but maybe you've got blankets, for example, that you want to really just give it that finishing touch before you give it to somebody. Garments before you assemble, if possible. And of course, gauge swatches, because if you're going to end up blocking your finished project, you should also block your gauge swatch so that all of your tension reads are correct. Just a quick side-by-side so you can see the difference blocking can make in your project. I've got two granny squares here, each made with the same weight yarn, hook size, and number of rounds. You can see the difference in the top unblocked square with its curled and rounded corners versus the bottom blocked square that lays flat, has crisp corners, and the stitches have opened up really nicely. There are a few different methods for blocking. Some say there are 3, but I say there's 3 plus a bonus. More on that in a minute. The basic formula for all of these methods is the same. Add moisture, pin into shape, and let dry. The difference in these methods is how much moisture is added and how it is added. Before we dive in and I show you how to use the various methods for blocking, let's talk a little first about basic tools. The items pictured here are the tools I use the most consistently when I need to block something. Granted, some of these are specific to one method or another, but they're what I consider my most basic tools. First up are my foam mats. The ones pictured here are those foam floor tiles that you see in playrooms or gyms. You can grab them at Walmart. I got mine at Aldi. They do actually make thicker, denser foam blocking mats that you can find at craft stores that come with grids on them, which is really nice when you are trying to pin something to a specific size. But these work just fine. Or if you don't have the extra money to spend even on these, then you can always just use some cardboard with a towel over it and pin into that. Before I had these mats, I just used a towel laid on top of my carpeted floor and pinned directly into the carpet pad. The other must-have is a set of good pins. When you're using this much water and moisture, you want to make sure that the pins you're using are rust-proof. And I find stainless steel pins like the T-pins pictured here work the best. Additionally, a towel, a steam iron or a steamer, a spray bottle with a mister function, and some stiffening spray round out the most basic tools that you would need to use for all of the various types of methods that we're going to discuss in this video. As with anything, there's always fancier tools that make your life a little easier, and blocking is no different. I've got a few things pictured here of what I would consider to be other helpful tools when you are blocking. So let's go over some of those. These wooden blocking boards and their metal rods, or pins as I call them, can be found all over Etsy if you search for them. This one is one that my stepdad made for me, so while you can't have this exact one, I can link to something similar in the description box below for you. But what I love about this, especially if you do a lot with motifs like granny squares, etc., is you can block multiple motifs in a very small amount of space, because the pins allow you to stack your motifs after you have wet them down or steamed them, or whichever method you're using to block. You can fit multiple stacks and then multiple pins on the same board. So it's really nice to kind of do everything in a very quick way without having to sit there and measure out every single time you want to block something as well. These Knitter's Pride knit blockers were on my Christmas list for a super long time, and I finally gave up asking for them and just went and played Santa to myself. They are a game changer if you have a project that has a lot of straight edges that you need to block out. Instead of using hundreds of individual pins, this actually combines several pins on a single solid piece so that you can save yourself a little bit of time. There are plenty of tools out there that I could go on about, but the last thing I'm going to talk about today is wool wash. So wool wash is for when you're using that soaking method, and if you're already soaking your project, you might as well go ahead and wash it while you're at it. If you don't have wool wash, you can use a mild detergent, something that would be safe for an infant, would be suitable for your project. The benefits to using a actual wool wash would be it also has like conditioning agents in there, so it's actually really good for the fibers themselves. Apart from that, Woolite, all free and clear, stuff like that works really well. Just a very small amount and something very, very gentle. Now that we've talked about what blocking is and why it's important, and we've gone over the basic tools that you'll need for blocking, let's take a deep dive into each of these methods. First up, we have the soak method, used when you have the most amount of stretching and shaping to do, and it works best for hardy animal fibers like wool or synthetic fibers like acrylic. The pros of this method is that it's highly malleable, so it gives you the most control over shaping exactly how you need to shape your piece. The cons is it's also at the highest risk for overstretching because it uses the most moisture. Also, it takes the longest amount of time because of drying time. For the soak method, you're going to need to grab a bucket, or you can use a sink. Just make sure it's clean. You'll need a towel. You'll need your blocking mats, your pins, and if you're going to use it, your wool wash. When I go for the soak method, I always use cold water. I add my wool wash, if I'm using it, to my water as it's running. That way I get it nice and sudsy, and then I'm good to go ahead and add my project. And when you add your project, you'll want to fully submerge it, make sure it's completely saturated. Since I'm washing my project in this video at the same time with the wool wash, I make sure I manipulate it a little bit, and then I'll let it soak for a few minutes. When I'm ready, I will drain the water and give it a good rinse just to make sure I get all the residual suds out of the project. And then it's time to go ahead and get rid of all that excess water. So you'll notice that I am pressing and squeezing my work here. I'm not wringing it. If you wring your work, you risk overstretching it and bending it out of shape. Then, just to finish getting the rest of the water out that you couldn't get from squeezing it, lay a towel out, lay your project flat on top of it, and roll your towel with your project inside of it and squeeze and press on it that way. Sometimes I'll even stand on it just to make sure I'm getting all of that extra moisture out of my project. Then you can go ahead and remove it from the towel and spread it out on your blocking mats into the shape that you need and get started pinning. The one thing you need to keep in mind when you are pinning is that you don't want to pin through the fibers if you can avoid it. That is a good rule of thumb across any of the blocking methods, so just keep that in mind. When you start pinning your work, I always like to start in the corners. So when I have a nice triangular or square or other geometrical shape, I start in those corners. I'll pin my first one and then I'll go to the corner opposite that if applicable. I mean, it's a little different when I'm working with a triangle like in this video, but if I've got like a square, I'll move to the opposite corner and then pin that corner, and then I'll go in that kind of an order so that I'm continually doing opposites. And once I've got all my corners pinned, then I'll go back through and I will attack my edges in the same kind of method where I'll do one edge and then I'll work the opposite edge. You'll want to make sure that all of your pins are evenly spaced. You don't want anything to tug into a weird pulling kind of look that you would get if it was uneven. And just try and keep your edges as straight as possible. Once you get those first set of pins in and your work is taking up nice shape, you're going to want to go back and fill in any gaps between your first set of pins to make sure that you get those edges nice and crisp and clean and straight, and there's no weird pulling on your work that you worked and spent so much time on. Once it's done being pinned, you can go ahead and just let it dry. I usually have to let mine sit overnight. Sometimes I'll put a fan on it just to speed up the process, but then once it is fully and completely dry, you can remove your pins and you're all done. Next is the spray method, or misting, which is used when you have less shaping to do or are using more delicate animal fibers like mohair, plant-based fibers like cotton or bamboo, or synthetic fibers. One of the pros for this method is that it takes less time than soaking because it doesn't use as much moisture. There's also less risk of overstretching. On the con side, it's less malleable than the soaking method, and there is still some risk of overstretching, and it takes longer than the steaming method. If you're choosing the spray blocking method, then you are going to need a spray bottle with a mister function, your foam blocking mats, and of course your pins. So I've got a cotton blend coaster here that I want these little peaks around the edge of my coaster to be nice and sharp. So I'm going to block it. I've got a spray bottle with a mister function. I've got my stainless steel T-pins and my foam mat, and I'm ready to get started. So I'm going to lightly spray the coaster on both sides. I want it to be wet enough that I can manipulate it and stretch it as needed, but not saturated so that I risk overstretching or anything like that. I'm going to get started pinning in my corners in those chain one spaces. That's the easiest place to grab it. And you'll notice that as I work my corners and pin them, I'm going to work the opposite corners. So I start with one and then I go to the corner opposite that to get started. Then I turn my work and I will gently pull into this round shape at the corners, always going in opposite corners before, instead of just going all the way around in a single order. I find that it helps me keep my shape even, and I have less risk of needing to repin later just to make adjustments because I've gotten it out of shape. Once I have everything pinned out and I'm happy with it, just like before, I'm going to let it dry. That can take a couple of hours, or sometimes I just let it sit overnight as well. It just depends on how wet you got it. And then once it is fully and completely dry, you're good to go ahead and remove the pins and admire your beautifully blocked piece. Rounding out the most common methods for blocking is the steam method, which uses the least amount of moisture for when you don't have as much stretching and shaping to do, and it works on any fiber. This is my preferred method for blocking when I am able to use it because of the pros. The fact that it works on any fiber is huge, and it's the fastest method. On the con side of things, it's the least malleable. It has a slight risk of killing fibers or melting synthetics if the iron or the steamer touches the fabric. So as long as you're hovering and not actually touching your fabric, you'll be fine. For the steam blocking method, you are going to need a steamer or a steam iron on the steam setting, your foam blocking mats, and your pins. In the previous methods that I've shown you, my preference is generally to add moisture and then pin, but when I steam block, I tend to pin first and then add moisture by steaming. So that's what I'm doing here. You're still going to use the same rules of thumb for pinning, where you pin your corners first and your opposite edges and get it into that desired shape or size, and then you will hover your steamer over your work so that the heat and the steam work together to really relax the fibers of your work. You'll notice that I said hovering and not touching. So when you are using this method, it is important not to let the metal plate of your iron or your steamer to touch the fabric of your work. If you do that, you risk damaging the fibers, or if you're using an acrylic or other synthetic yarn, you could actually potentially melt the yarn, and that's going to make you really sad after all the hours that you put into your project. After that, once you're done steaming everything, let it dry just like the other methods. It won't take as long as the other methods because you're not applying as much moisture, which is why this is one of my favorite methods. I'm a very impatient person myself. So once you're done, and it's dry, you can go ahead and remove it from the pins and from the blocks, and you are set. Last is our bonus method of stiffening for when you want your work to hold its shape permanently. This uses a starch or a glue solution or a fabric stiffening spray in conjunction with a form to make your project hold its shape. This is used for earrings, ornaments, doilies. I've used it for bookmarks. You might have seen those crochet tree topper angels. This method is used for all of those. This is used primarily with cotton. I've never seen it on anything else. I'm not saying you can't use it on other fibers. I'm saying I don't know what that looks like, so you would have to experiment. But depending on the size of your project, you can soak this in a basin with the solution in the basin, or you can use a stiffening spray like what's in the background of this slide, which is what I use when I'm making my ornaments and my earrings and things like that. When you need to stiffen your project, you're either going to soak or spray using the methods that we've already discussed. The difference here is that instead of just using water, you're actually going to be using a solution that has an adhesive of some kind in it, whether it's glue or starch. That way, your project will permanently hold its shape. For this method, you are going to need a foam blocking mat, some stiffening spray or some kind of a solution, your pins, and I like to use either wax paper or parchment paper because it keeps my foam mats protected from the glue or the starch, whatever may be in my stiffening spray. So I've got a crochet thread bookmark that I want to block. I've got my stainless steel pins, my Aleene's stiffening spray, Stiffen Quick, and I have my foam mat with my wax paper over it to protect it. And I am going to want to set off these little peacoats that go around the edge of my bookmark here. And I also want to make the tail leading into the end of it nice and straight. So I'm going to coat my bookmark with the stiffening spray. I usually spray it until it's pretty well saturated because I really don't want it to lose its shape at all. Some of that excess goes onto the mat, so I just kind of soak it up on the opposite side of my work there, and just make sure that both sides are good and saturated and ready before you start pinning. So when it is good and saturated, you'll get your pins and you'll pin them just in the same methods that we've discussed previously in the video. I will always start in one location, usually in the top, or in this case, the bottom, and then pin opposite and kind of go from there. So I couldn't pin directly opposite in this case, so I'm doing the two that kind of straddle the one that's opposite. And then I'm just going to keep working around and getting that shape that I want as desired. Just like before in the other methods, you're going to allow your work to dry completely before you start to remove your pins. But then once you do and you peel it off of your wax paper or your parchment paper, you'll see how well it is holding its shape and it is not going anywhere. So that's it for our 3 methods plus our bonus method. Just a few tips to finish up the video with. When you are pinning, just make sure that you're pinning those corners first and then do the edges and fill in the gaps as you go. You want to make sure that you're working in opposites. So if you pin one corner, go pin the opposite corner next instead of doing the neighboring corner, and the same for edges. So you do that all the way around. It'll help make sure that you have less chance of having to readjust your shape later. Also, speaking of pinning, don't pin through the fibers of your yarn if you can avoid it. That runs the risk of those sharp pins cutting the plies of your fiber, and that's going to make you sad. Also, keep in mind that the wetter the fabric, the higher the risk of overstretching. So, especially in that soaking method and on projects that are like heavy on the lace work and just prone to stretching in general, you just want to make sure that you're being very gentle in shaping and stretching your work as you are blocking. Speaking of being gentle, never wring the excess water out of your work. Just press and squeeze it out of your work. And another thing to do is never let your steamer or your iron touch your work. That's it for this video on blocking. I'm going to have a detailed blog post linked in the description box below for you that has all of this in a written format with photos and links to the items that I'm using or items similar to what I'm using, so that you guys can reference that as you want to do. And if you found this informative, be sure that you give it a thumbs up. I know that it was a long one, so thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking with me, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Bye!